training is really an attempt to improve employee performance on a current job. It differs from education or development. Education is really making people smarter, helping them grow. Development is essentially the same thing. It's open-ended. Training is closed-ended. It is about getting higher performance on the job. Organizations spend an enormous amount of money on training expenditures. It's really about 125, 126 billion dollars a year that are spent just by organizations on training and development. In 2009, in a survey of organizations, they spent an average of 47 hours per employee per year in training. So training is a big business. When you think about training, you really have to think about training as a model. A systems model of training includes needs assessment and then development, design, and delivery of the training, and then evaluation of the training program. And so you need to do an assessment up front that determines what should be trained, and then you develop it and deliver it, and then you do an evaluation at the end to determine whether you did deliver the training and you had the outcomes that you wanted to have for the training program. Each of these includes a number of things. Needs assessment is always the essential first step. It is time consuming. It's much like painting. If you paint a room in your house, you spend more time getting ready for the painting than you actually do the painting. The sanding and the taping and the cleaning and all of that goes into painting really takes more time than actually painting the room. It is the same for training. If you do training right, you will spend more time assessing the need, because the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of money training the wrong thing. And so in needs analysis, an organization will attempt to figure out what needs to be trained, how it should be trained, and it really is done in three parts. The first part is called organizational analysis. The second part is called task analysis. And then the third part is called person analysis. The organizational analysis answers questions about the organization, where the training focus should be, where it should be placed, what factors might affect training, all the things about the organization that would have something to do with a training program. Task analysis answers the question of what should be taught, what tasks should be taught in the training program. Person analysis answers the question of who needs the training and possibly why they need the training or what specific type of training they need. Some people accept training easier if it's on video, some people accept training easier if it's written. People have different styles of learning. Let's start with organizational analysis. Organizational analysis really reviews what the organization's strategy is. What are the organization's short and long-term goals? You would review human resource inventories and performance appraisal data to find out where there may be deficiencies in learning. You would look at other aspects of the organization so that you could separate motivation from training. That's a really important concept. Effort is a function of ability plus effort. Training affects ability, but it doesn't necessarily affect effort. What affects effort is rewards. And we talked about that in the last chapter in performance appraisal. If you reward people, that's what motivates them to perform. Training is to give them the skill to perform. So it's a two-part equation. It's skill and abilities on one side, which is a training function, and it's motivation and effort on the other side, and that's a reward function or a function of your reward system. So organizational analysis would look at that issue. Is the lack of behavior, lack of outcome, due to a poor reward structure? And if that's the case, then you would intervene in a different way from training. You might review satisfaction inventories or climate inventories. You basically would review everything in the organization that would tell you what needs to be done from a training point of view to increase the skill and ability or outcomes of your workforce. So that's one thing that's going on in organizational analysis. Another thing that goes on in organizational analysis is to look at the facilities and the resources you have available for training. Do you have people in-house that are capable of doing the training? If you don't have somebody with the skill base inside the organization, you would probably go outside of the organization and hire a consultant or a training company to provide your training. Do you have the resources as far as rooms and training facilities to give the training? If not, then you would have to make the choice of going to an outside organization or putting the training online. Maybe you want the training all online. And so there's a lot of issues about resources and facilities that get answered in organizational analysis too. If you have an organization that's spread across the entire country or world, you would probably put your training online so that it could be delivered relatively inexpensively across the world. It may be so behaviorally based that you can't put it online. So those are the kinds of issues that are looked at that second part of organizational analysis. Do you have the ability to do the training? The second analysis is task analysis, and it really, like I said, it's aimed at telling you what should be taught. Now remember, in previous chapters we've talked about competencies and we've talked about tasks. When we talked about work analysis and we talked about performance appraisal, we made the distinction between knowledge and skill and attitude, and competencies may not be task related. They may be things like assertiveness, which is not really a task. It's something that you know how to do. And so when you do job analysis or task analysis, you need to separate things that are competency-based from things that are purely task-based, because that's going to drive what kind of training you have. If your training is very task-based, it's going to be step-by-step. This is how you do the task. You might have a lot of videos, or you might have a lot of hands on a piece of equipment to do the training. If the training is more competency-based, there might be a lot of self-assessment, there might be counseling and coaching involved, there may be a lot of personal, interpersonal practice on how to do something. It depends upon that task analysis, that job analysis that you're doing for your needs analysis, your training needs analysis, to separate those things out. You may in fact have a problem that's part task, part competency, part knowledge. Well, you can gain the knowledge by reading a book or watching a video. You can learn the task by actually working on a piece of equipment, and you can learn a competency in some other form. And so that analysis breaks all of that down and tells you really the kind of approach that you would have in your training program. Person analysis really answers the question of who needs the training and what kind of training. One of the things that you look at in person analysis is, what do they know now? Some kinds of learning need remedial steps or prerequisites. You don't learn statistics until you've learned algebra, and you don't learn algebra until you've learned math. So when you go to school, you usually take math and then algebra and then statistics, and then you go into research design, and there's a progress or a progression of learning. And if that's the case, if you find the task analysis that you need to learn at a certain level, and you go back into the person analysis and you find out that the people don't have the prerequisite skills, then your training program needs to go through the step-by-step basis to give whatever the remedial learning is that's needed. So that's one of the things that goes into person analysis. Part of it is just, do people have the physical skills or the physical mentality to do something? If I was going to teach you how to salute the military way, if you didn't have a right arm, it would be impossible for me to teach you to salute. And so that sounds stupid, but that's essentially what you're doing. If people don't have the prerequisite resources or skills, we've got to make sure the training program gives that to them too. So there's a lot of assessment that goes into that. There's, again, a lot of looking at performance appraisal. Self-assessments are often used. There actually might be a self-assessment that's built into a training program, where we bring people into a training program, they do assessment or self-assessment, and then they're separated into people that need remedial training and people that can go into the more complex training. But that's what personal analysis is all about. It looks at what the person is at this point and are they ready for the training. They also, in person analysis, tend to look at learning types a little bit. The research on learning styles is not, one, it's not good research, and number two, it's not clear that there are learning styles. But there is some evidence that people do learn in different ways. And some people like pictures, some people like verbal, some people can look at more of an item than others. Typically, we can deal with 7 plus or minus 2 or 3 items separately at one time. And if you've got people that can deal with 15 items at one time, then you would change your training. If you have people that can only deal with 5, their training would become shorter and more step-by-step. You would also look at your training audience for reading level and comprehension. You would look at them for motivation. If they're not motivated to take the training, you might come and do a training program for their supervisors first. So their supervisors can then go back on the job and create a climate that creates more motivation for the training that you're trying to provide. Anyway, those are the 3 kinds of analyses that one would do to get prepared for training. And you can see that if you were just doing something for your department of 20 people, that might be a fairly easy task. You know about the organization, you could write down the tasks, and you could go out and look at your people. You probably understand your people already. If you had an organization with 300,000 people in it, and you had to train everybody in that organization for something such as sexual harassment, this kind of needs assessment will be a much more complex endeavor. What you do when you gather all that information is you then write instructional objectives. They might be called different things. They might be called learning objectives or instructional objectives. They might be called key behaviors. A learning objective really is designed to say that this is something that you simply have to learn. You have to look at it, memorize it, put it in your head. That's what a learning objective is. An instructional or a behavioral objective gets more complex. It really describes something that you have to do. And then when you get into key behaviors, and you've seen key behaviors in the interpersonal skills practices that are in this course, those key behaviors are step-by-step how you do something. Some of those key behaviors are truly step-by-step. Some of them are rule-oriented. When you get to complex social behavior, you're really talking about rules, not a step-by-step set of behaviors. If you think about going back to interviewing, if you think about the first steps of an interview, one of the first steps of an interview is to establish rapport with the interviewee. Well, we're not telling you how to do that. We're just simply saying you need to establish rapport with the interviewee. That's a rule-based key behavior. And so how the objectives are written are very important. You can write them based on knowledge. You can write them based on on behavior, or you can write them based on rules, something that needs to get done, an outcome. And so behavioral objectives are critical because they drive how your training is going to be done. I will tell you one thing, this is a little decorism. If you cannot write it down in a behavioral objective, you cannot teach it to somebody. Very simple fact of life. If you can't write it down, you don't know what it is, and you can't possibly teach it to somebody else. So behavioral objectives, to me, are critical. I'm less concerned about in what form they are than that you could actually write them down and tell me what this training is, and also write them down in a form that tells me how the training is going to be done. Behavioral objectives tell me the training is going to be behavioral. You're going to practice. Learning objectives tell me that you're going to read, listen, memorize, spit it back on a test. So you're really designing your training program by how you put your behavioral objectives together. Now, let's move to the development of the training program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time to say specifically how you're going to develop a training program. There are different kinds of training, and we'll come to that. But let's first talk about the preconditions of learning. Basically, there are lots of things about individuals that are important. And we talked about a couple of them. One of them is motivation to learn. If your trainees are not motivated to learn, they will not. You've got to create a training program that's fun, that fun may not be the right word, but you've got to create a training program that has value to the people taking it. If they don't see value in the training, they won't be motivated to sit there and listen to the training or be involved in the training. And so motivation is very important. You have to access readiness to learn or readiness to participate in the training. We talked about that in person analysis. And so if a person's not ready, that needs to be assessed as part of the preconditions. There are a lot of things that are actual conditions of the training program. One of them we've already talked about is whole versus part learning. Can I teach something to you all in one piece, or do I have to break it up in pieces? When you saw the key behaviors for interviewing, that was broken into 4 parts: opening the interview, asking questions, giving information about the organization, and then closing the interview. And there were a set of key behaviors for each of those parts. The issue is that the whole process of interviewing is too big for somebody to process at one time. So I broke it up into 4 parts with no more than 10 key behaviors per part on average. And so that's part learning. If it's too big, you break it into pieces and you teach it to people in pieces. You always have to put it together at the end. You should show people the whole, break it into pieces, train people, make sure they understand each piece and can do it, and then put the whole thing together at the end and make sure they can do the whole behavior. And so that's a really important issue, because most of the training that you're going to be doing with people is complex training that you'll have to break into pieces. Another is massed versus spaced practice. Massed practice is all at once. Spaced is spaced out over time. If you've got a physical task like playing basketball or football or whatever, you're not going to do massed practice simply because you'll be exhausted. And so you'll space that practice out. Most practice is spaced out in training. People need to go practice something, get used to it, come back and practice something a little bit more complex, etc. Another item in training is overlearning. Overlearning is learning something or practicing something beyond the point of learning it. The example I always have in my head, because I had to do it, is I had to memorize poetry when I was in English class in high school, and I happened to take the English class from the mother of the girl that I was dating at the time. It wasn't easy. But she always called on me, "Decker, can you recite that poem?" And I would practice on the bus every day for that class, and I would have that poem down absolutely perfect, and I'd quit. I didn't overlearn it. I didn't practice beyond the point of first accurate reproduction of the behavior. So I'd memorize till I could say the poem perfectly, quit and go have fun on the bus. And I'd go into class. Mrs. Perkins would call on me every time, and because she didn't really like me. And I'd blow it. I'd leave a line out and be in trouble, look stupid. And if I had practiced that poem for another 10 or 15 minutes past the point of being able to say it, I would have overlearned it, and I probably would have done better in her class. Another is goal setting, and you know about goal setting. We've been through goal setting. Employees improve their performance when they set goals that are specific and they get feedback, etc., etc. So goal setting should be involved in any kind of training program. Knowledge of results, which is just a fancy word for feedback. People have to get feedback about where they are in relation to knowledge. If they're trying to learn something, they need to be given timely and specific feedback. So that needs to be included in your training program. Practice needs to be in there regardless. I talked about mass versus space practice, but you cannot learn something without practicing it. One of the things that's very clear from social learning theory is that you have to be shown a model of the proper way to do something. You then need to practice it and get lots of feedback and ultimately get some kind of reward for the behavior. So show it to somebody, give them practice, and give them feedback and reward for doing it correctly. That has to be built into your training program. Another thing that has to be built into your training program is attention. If you don't keep people's attention, then they don't know, if you show them a model of what is supposed to be done, they have to attend to the model. If I gave you guys a video in black and white, what would you think about it? Well, you'd think it's old and outdated and whatever, and if you started to think that, you probably wouldn't pay attention to it. And so I need to give you a video that's current, that's in color, with people not in leisure suits and whatever, so that you had some motivation to actually look at it and learn from it. Another is retention. It's one thing to get your attention, but I then need you to retain something in your head. I have to get information into your short-term memory and then into your long-term memory. That's just a two-step process. I can get you to retain short-term by getting your attention and getting you to symbolically rehearse. Symbolic rehearsal is pretty important. You've probably seen people do it in sports. If you watch the Summer or the Winter Olympics, the gymnastics people did it this last year. They will actually picture themselves going through their routine in their head, and that symbolic rehearsal or that picturing it is extremely powerful. That helps retain information. And so if I want you to attend to something, I want you to symbolically rehearse it, and then I want you to physically rehearse it. If I can do those things, I'll get you to retain learning. There's two other things. One is transfer of training. Transfer of training is really, once I've got you to learn something, transferring it onto the job. The transfer of training is taking it from the training program to the job, and it's really kind of a two-step process. I need to get you to learn something in a training program, then I need you to get you to practice it on the job and be reinforced for it on the job. What happens if I taught you guys in a very successful training program that you should hug your employees 3 times a day? And if you hug your employees, your performance of your department would go up 15%. And we would spend all kinds of role playing. You would be hugging each other and having a good time. And it would be a great training program, and you'd be the best huggers, and you'd hit the workforce on Monday morning ready to hug your employees. And guess what? By 11 o'clock, you'd probably have 2 suits against you for sexual harassment. Somebody probably would have hit you, and the rest of them would be avoiding you by lunch. And so what's going to happen to the training program? I spent a perfectly good day or half a day training you to hug. And what happened? that training program probably got killed within a couple of hours because you were punished for doing it on the job. So as a trainer, I have to make sure my training is very good, but I also have to make sure it gets transferred on the job. Now, obviously, one of the keys to that is to make sure the training is the correct thing. Hugging employees to get higher performance may not be the correct thing. And so part of that is to align the training program to what the correct outcomes are. Another is to align the training so that the same kind of equipment and settings get used. If I have a training program and I teach everybody to use Apple computers perfectly, and they go on the job and they go to work on Monday and they have Windows programs on PCs, and particularly Windows 8 or the newest version, they may not transfer that training at all. It just may not work. So there's a lot of things that go into transfer of training that have to be built into a training program when I develop it. The last thing I'm going to talk about is relapse prevention. Relapse prevention comes out of the alcoholism literature. Basically, people that go into high-risk situations tend to relapse. And like if you're on a diet and you go to a diet program, you go to Weight Watchers or something, and you're all hopped up and everybody's eager to lose weight and blah, 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 and you go home at 8 o'clock after the meeting and your spouse just baked the best looking brownies you've ever seen. What are you going to do? You're going to stick your finger in them and taste it, and then boom, you probably have a brownie. And then the next thing you say to yourself, well, what the heck, I've already screwed up. Let's have 3 brownies and get it over with. Or let's eat the whole pan. That's the best thing. Well, there are names for all of that, but basically that's a high-risk situation. One of the things you do in relapse prevention is you teach employees what the high risks are and teach them to, 1, avoid them, and 2, practice those situations so they know how to handle them. What are you going to do when you go home and there's a whole plate of brownies sitting there, fresh, hot, warm? Get a game plan for doing that. And so that's part of relapse training. You develop coping strategies, etc. That happens with employee training all the time. I teach a set of managers how to do something like hug and send them out in the workforce, and their employees punish them for it. They're going to stop doing the behavior. And so my training program was a waste because I didn't build relapse prevention into it. One of the best things you can do for relapse prevention in a program, particularly if it's behaviorally based, is practice real situations. Let the managers that are in the training program tell you what their high-risk situations are on the job, and then actually practice those situations so when they go on the job they're prepared for it. So that's what relapse training is. So all of this goes into choosing a training program, and I'll let you read the book on the different kinds of training programs, but they really fall in two categories, informational or experiential. You're either being informed, like right now, this is an informational training program you're in for this next few minutes. The next would be experiential. When you go do the exercise, that's an experiential exercise. You're actually doing it. So all training falls into one or the other. Obviously, informational training programs could all be in a book, computerized. You don't need an instructor particularly. The instructor is really there to answer questions. Experiential training, depending upon the trainees, the trainees might be able to do experiential stuff by themselves if it was structured well, etc. Trainers are starting to get cut out of the loop to some extent. But all training falls in those two categories. Now, cost is a consideration. Training programs, particularly experiential training programs, can be very costly. If you have to go outside of your organization to hire a consultant or a trainer, then that gets expensive if you can't do it in-house. Now, in-house training tends to have a lot more of the elements of transfer of training. In-house training is better for transfer of training. Training that's purchased outside has less transfer of training. So that's one consideration, but cost is the other. Outside training costs more than inside training typically. But you have lectures, you have audio visual, you have self-directed materials, whether it's online or in a book. You have social media training, YouTube. This video that I'm making right now is going to end up on YouTube if it's any good. The bottom line is that's that. I mean, I can create a YouTube channel for this course and put every one of the lectures on it, and that's the cheapest, easiest way to do training in the world. There are lots of experiential methods. You're going to practice one of them in the exercises, on-the-job training. That's experiential, and it's not very costly. But you can get very expensive with experiential. You can go to computer-based training that's experiential. You can go to behavior modeling training that's very expensive. Behavior modeling training uses video and practice and feedback. It's really based on social learning theory, which you can read about in your book. But social learning theory says model the behavior, attend to it, retain it, and then practice it till you can get to transfer, get reinforced for it, etc. So it's a fairly complex training program, but it's based on social learning theory, and it gets expensive because it's small group, it's experiential, and it needs lots of trainers for feedback. And if you do video feedback, it can be expensive because you have to show the model on the on video in some form, computerized or not, and then you have to video people to help give feedback. And so it can get expensive. You have all kinds of simulations, equipment simulators, like pilots train on simulators simply because of the price of fuel to run a jetliner. Case analyses, role playing, you've done those things in class, in different kinds of classes. And so what you've got is a lot of elements of training that need to go in there, like transfer of training and relapse training and those things. And then you have considerations on different kinds of training methods that are based on cost or the kinds of outcomes, the learning outcomes that you want in the training. And all of those are complex decisions, and that's probably why you're going to hire a training manager, because that training manager is going to make those decisions, do the needs analysis, and then spend the time either buying the training or putting the training together. You as an executive have to ask yourself really one simple question. Does it tell people what should be done? Does it have a model? Is there enough practice to get people comfortable with it and ensure transfer of training? And is there going to be feedback on the job so that if it does get into the job, it gets reinforced and continues? So as an executive, every time you look at a training program, is there a model? Is there practice? Is there transfer of training? If you're trying to get an experiential outcome, a lecture program's not going to do that. So those are the kinds of decisions you make as an executive. The rest of it you leave to your training manager. And how you get a training manager, go back to the selection chapter and hire somebody that knows how to do those things. Let's talk about evaluation. Evaluation is really a measure of whether you did what you said you were going to do. You said, here are the behavioral objectives. I've designed this training program to teach those behavioral objectives. Did I do that? Did I get the outcome I wanted? This is important. There's 4 criteria for evaluation at the end. One is reaction. Did people like the training? Their opinions about the training. The second is learning. The third is behavior. And the fourth is organizational result. The ease of evaluation gets easier towards reaction and more difficult towards organizational result. And so it's more costly to look to measure behavior and organizational result. It's very easy to measure reaction. You guys sit in classes, and at the end of the class you get a course evaluation form that you fill out on the last day of class. Did you like the class? Did you like the professor? Blah, 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 blah. That's trainee reaction. And it's very easy to manipulate. If I give you good food and lots of soda and I'm funny and so forth, I'll get good trainee reaction. Learning is the equivalent of you taking a test. You go take a course, read the book, and take a test. That's a measure of learning only. It's not a measure of your behavior. Excuse this interruption. The third is behavior, measuring behavior. That is something that gets more complex. You either have to have observers of the behavior or you have to video the behavior. You're actually measuring some kind of performance. And that's why you start to get more costly, have to have more trainers, whatever. Often peer groups within the training can't really evaluate each other because they haven't been trained on how to do it. They don't know what the behavioral objectives are or the key behaviors. And so it really takes trained raters usually to do behavioral assessment. Organizational result is the impact the training had on the actual company's outcomes. And that becomes very hard. It really is a research design, and this course is not a research design course, but that one paragraph on a slide or in your book is really an entire training program. How do you do evaluation of a result? And it's a very complex question. If I do a training program, how much power does that training program really have to the bottom line outcome for an organization? That's the real question. And so you always are sorting out power. How much impact does a training program really have? Because, you know, if I give the best training program in the world and you have a hurricane, then the hurricane's probably going to be much more disruptive than anything that the training does. And so that's a question of power. One of the things that trainers tend to do is they tend to gravitate towards the easy, more positive evaluations. If I give an evaluation based on your opinions of the training and I give you a test at the end of the training program, I can usually get high scores on that and I look good as a trainer. If I start to measure whether I've changed your behavior or whether your behavior had any actual effect on the organization, it becomes much harder for me to get a really true big positive effect. So as a trainer, I'm really not very interested in the more complex evaluations. One, because they're costly, they're time consuming, and they're about a 50-50 chance of showing that my training had any effect. So I'm probably going to stay towards the reaction and learning kind of measurement. You as an executive have to continue to ask that training manager, how are you evaluating your training? What is my return on investment? That training program makes everybody happy, may not have a big return on investment. So your job as an executive is to push your trainers to show that they're really having an effect on the organization. Did you change behavior? Did you change organizational result? Having happy trainers is cool, but did you do anything for my bottom line budget? Did you have a return on investment? And so that becomes part of the overall assessment of costs and benefits of training. You put so much money into training, what was the outcome in return on investment? So your trainers should always be able to give you a cost-benefit analysis of their training in dollars and cents. And that's one of the things that you have to do as an executive. Tell your trainer, the bottom line is, I want you to show me that you've had an effect on this organization. That's strategic training or a strategic training system. There's lots of special kinds of training programs, and there's a section on your textbook, and I'm just going to whiz through those really quickly. You can look in the textbook. But training for generational transitions, one of the big things that you're going to see in the next few years is that we're going to have a shortage of competencies in certain areas because the older generation is retiring. There's this huge glob of people that are baby boomers that are about 60 now, turning 65, and they're all going to retire, not as quickly as we would have before the recession, but they will retire, or they'll die. And you're going to have to replace those competencies. Well, that's a very large bubble of people, and there's not enough nurses coming through nursing school right now to replace all the nurses who are working. And so we're going to have a lot of specialized training to pick up competencies that we're going to lose in generations. We're also going to have specialized training to handle different generations. The generations that come behind you are different than your generation. You guys are different than my generation. And so you'll find specialized training to deal with that. There are lots of managers out there today that don't know how to deal with LinkedIn, they don't know how to deal with YouTube, they don't know how to tweet. Those are becoming very cost-effective ways to interact, to recruit employees, to train employees. And if you've got a generation of people that doesn't know how to use the cloud, so to speak, you're wasting huge resources. If you've got employees that don't know how to use pads and they're stuck behind but the desktop computers, that's going to be an issue within the next 5 or 10 years. So anyway, generational training is going to be a big part of it. All organizations have orientation programs or training for bringing people on board. There's a lot of training that goes on to orient people, to teach them the rules, to give them what they need to know to come on board the organization. We're also going to have a lot of team training. I don't care if it's in quality improvement or where it is. We're going to put more and more of the work in teams, and we're going to have to teach the teams how to operate. So teams training. Diversity training is another. Teaching people how to handle diversity. We will get more and more diversity in the workforce, and we need to teach people how to handle that diversity. As we get to be more global, we'll have to handle global diversity. Sexual harassment training we talked about in the first few chapters of the textbook. We have to teach people behaviorally how to handle sex discrimination and sexual harassment. Cross-cultural training, cultural intelligence, those are all specialized kinds of training that you're going to see. So let me sum it up. We should have a training system in an organization. Figure out what needs to be trained, develop the training, make sure it includes all the elements for a good training program, and then evaluate the training, see if you actually did it, evaluate at the most complex level, behavioral or organizational result. That's difficult. You may have to hire a person specialized in doing that kind of research, but the only way you're really going to determine return on investment for training is to do that higher order training evaluation. Don't forget that behavioral objectives are critical. If you cannot write it down, you don't know how to train it. And how you write it down will determine what kind of training program you have, whether it's informational or whether it's experiential. And then you can read about all the specialized different kinds of training programs. You can read about the different issues in putting training programs together, cost, whether it should be in-house or consulted out. Lots of issues in that. Do you have the facilities to do the training, the resources to do the training? I went through a number of things that are critical learning items, how people learn. You have to make sure that you break training up if it's complex. You have to make sure that people practice. You have to make sure that you teach your people to handle relapses or bad situations. You have to make sure that there's enough behavioral practice if you're teaching behaviors. All of those elements need to be pushed into the training program. If you're teaching a generalized rule set of behaviors that are to be applied across a number of different kinds of people, then you would like to have that generalized in your training program. You don't teach one person to do one thing with one other person. You let them practice a skill on a whole lot of other people so that they can generalize it to work much easier. And then, of course, the evaluation issues as part of the system. How do you evaluate? What do you evaluate? How forcefully do you evaluate? Do you really put it in dollars and cents? And the answer to that is you should. Because any trainer can give you all kinds of data that says this is wonderful training when it in fact has no effect on your organization. So you've got to hold your trainers' feet to the fire to make sure that they can prove their training actually has some outcome. I skipped over a lot of things. Social learning theory, you should probably go back and look at what it is, what it says. Most of the training that you'll give in organizations at the higher level is social level training. It's interpersonal, and you'll use some kind of social behavioral experiential training with it. Granted, there's a lot of training programs that are informational or are low level experiential, a lot of nursing tasks, but that's not what's going to change the strategy of a healthcare organization. Teaching a nurse to change a bandage is fine, and they all need to know that, but teaching that nurse to interact with the patients and the physicians in certain ways, or pay attention to costs, or pay attention to quality improvement, that is what's in your strategic plan. And so that kind of training becomes much more complex, and it's the kind of training that you'll probably pay attention to as an executive. You'll probably let all of that straightforward training be done in nursing, for instance, at a lower level. The prescriptive stuff, the things that can be described step by step, much like a doctor's office used to do everything. Now a doctor's office, an internist, tends to do a lot of diagnosis, and the prescriptive medicine tends to be done at ready clinics or someplace like that. If you've got a flu, go to the ready clinic, get it done, walk out with your prescription in less than a half an hour. You wouldn't want to schedule an appointment with an internist 3 days from now, spend 3 hours in that person's office waiting, and then be told, oh yes, you've got a sinus infection, here's a drug for it. You can get that done in a ready clinic in literally 15 minutes. That's prescriptive medicine. There's places for that. This is more complex diagnostic medicine. This is the place for that. As an executive, you're probably going to be dealing with the more complex stuff. Which is why you need to think of this as a system and think about the elements of the training program. Make sure the behavioral objectives point to what you want for an outcome, and make sure it's evaluated. That's how you do training. We're not going to get in, I don't have time to get into all the different little methods of training. Most training is going to be computerized in the future. Most of it's going to be experiential. The end.